we are here today with Natalie Wexler. Natalie Wexler is a journalist and writer who specialized in education. She's the author of two well-known books. One is The Writing Revolution with Judith Hochman, and the other is The Knowledge Gap. And we are going to concentrate today on this book. They are both good reads, but they are surprisingly deep. They go into the classroom, they go into the pedagogical theories that direct the way things are taught. So, Natalie, thank you very much for being here. Welcome to Lisbon.
Thank you.
And thank you for agreeing to do this interview.
It's my pleasure.
As I was saying, this book is a very deep book about education. And you describe here a couple of things about America, but they are also interesting for Portuguese public and for public everywhere, because these debates are debates that are worldwide debates in a way. So you describe what happened in America, and you say knowledge gap. There is some problem about teaching how to read. What are the problems?
Well, so there are a lot of problems. The book really focuses on the way American elementary schools go about teaching children to read, but not just how to decipher the words, not just the decoding aspect of reading. That's a problem. We have a big problem with that, but it really focuses more on how teachers try to help kids understand, comprehension, so understanding what they read. And the standard approach is to teach that as a set of comprehension skills and strategies, like finding the main idea or making inferences, comparing and contrasting. And the theory is that if kids just get really good at those skills, that later on they can use them to understand anything they're reading, and that's when they can acquire knowledge from their reading. In the 1970s and 1980s, there was this new trend to just, the theory was if you just surround kids with good children's literature, they will naturally learn how to read. It sounds kind of crazy, but it really caught on. It was very, I think it appealed to teachers. They thought, yes, we love children's literature, and the theory is based on the idea that learning to read is a natural process like learning to speak.
But it's not. It's a social process.
It's definitely not. And most kids, not all kids, but most kids, in order to read fluently, they need to be explicitly taught. But teachers across the country embraced this idea of whole language. And then in California, the whole state, the textbooks became whole language textbooks. And their test scores on national tests went way down. And so it's not clear it was all because of whole language, but because of that, whole language acquired a bad reputation. And so the education establishment said, okay, we won't teach that anymore. We have something new called balanced literacy, and it will incorporate the best of phonics and the best of whole language. So we'll teach phonics, but we'll also surround kids with great children's literature.
And phonics is?
Phonics is the idea that you teach, instead of teaching kids just to recognize whole words, which was the whole word theory, you teach them rules about how words work, how letters, the correspondences between sounds and letters, so that they can apply those rules to sound out words they don't already know. Okay. And so balanced literacy was supposed to incorporate that idea. The problem is the people who led that balanced literacy movement, and still do lead it, and it's really everywhere in the United States now, they came from the whole language movement. And so they were always very skeptical of phonics. They thought if you teach kids these rules and you just have this drilling kids on these rules, it will kill children's love of reading. They'll never love to read. So they put in a little bit of phonics, but really they didn't ever embrace it in a systematic way. And so teachers now, many teachers, they think they're teaching phonics, but it's not systematic. It's just when a question comes up, they'll teach a rule, and they also are still encouraging kids to look at the pictures and guess what the word might be, or look at the context and guess what the word might be. And that's easier than sounding out the word. So children do that instead, and that works only as long as the books have pictures or simple vocabulary. And so what happens is when kids get to 4th grade, 5th grade, when they get to be maybe 9 or 10, and the words get more complicated, and the books don't have pictures anymore, they hit a wall and they can't read it. You know, it looked like they were reading before, but they were just guessing.
So if I'm interpreting you well, what you are saying is that with this pretext of love of reading, kids are not taught how to read fluently, and so they cannot love reading.
Exactly. I mean, it's very hard to love reading if you can't read, yes.
But this is kind of surprising because even after the Clinton panel, so Clinton created a national reading panel, is that
Yes.
the right way, the name?
Yes.
And the conclusions of that panel are very clear as far as I know. They say phonics is the way to go. And even after that,
Yeah.
and that was the panel of the best scientists in the United States and even with foreign consultants, and it was very clear, phonics is the way to go to teach how to read.
Yeah.
And even after that, we still have the same problems, or you still have the same problems?
Yes. I mean, I think in recent years, it's changing for the better, but there was a lot of resistance to the conclusions of that national reading panel. Educators just, they challenged the science, and there's this, I don't want to generalize too much, but I think many educators are a little suspicious of the scientists who haven't taught, they haven't been in classrooms, they're in some sort of laboratory, or they do studies, but they don't really know what goes on in the classroom. That's part of it. Another part of it is that for some reason, phonics has always been identified in the United States with political conservatism. And, oh yeah, going back to the 1950s. It doesn't make sense, but that is...
So ideology instead
yes.
of science again.
Yes. So you mentioned Clinton convened this blue ribbon panel of experts. That's true, but the conclusions of the report were implemented under the next president, George W. Bush, who was a Republican. And that did not help the cause of phonics because it was, even though it started under a Democrat, it was perceived as being a Republican initiative, and teachers tend to be Democrats, they tend to be liberal, and so that didn't help. But there was a big program called Reading First under George W. Bush that seems to have been pretty successful, but for various reasons it was discontinued after about 4 or 5 years, and people went back to doing what they did before.
We are lucky in Portugal because we follow the tradition of a great educator, João de Deus, who wrote a textbook, a cartilha, that's the name we say, and that was phonics. So I learned how to read with that book or with derivatives of that book, and many people had the same type of teaching, and so we have been using phonics. But what you are describing is, and where you started, is it's more interesting and it's wider, because what you are saying is that with the pretext of getting knowledge to kids, or with the pretext of getting general knowledge, you are stressing skills and not knowledge. So from where you started, could you develop that idea,
so
please?
It gets a little confusing because it is important to teach skills when we're talking about decoding.
Okay.
That is a set of skills. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about comprehension, it's really more about knowledge. Comprehension is far more dependent on either knowledge of the topic or knowledge of general academic vocabulary than it is on skills. And teachers in the United States, unfortunately, have been trained to believe exactly the opposite. They have they proceeded on the assumption that the decoding part is something that grows naturally if you just surround kids with great literature, and that the comprehension part should be taught as a set of skills. So it's exactly the opposite of what cognitive scientists have found about each of those aspects of reading. And that's why we have a big part of the reason we have such poor results on our reading tests.
That's a very good point. But the same happens, I think, everywhere. The same happens all over the world, that people are convinced that knowing some skills or mastering some skills, they're able to get knowledge naturally. And that doesn't work exactly like that.
Yes, there's a lot of emphasis these days on critical thinking skills or 21st century skills. But something like critical thinking or finding the main idea of something, it's not a generally applicable skill like riding a bike or like decoding words. It really, if I am reading about a topic I know a lot about, I'm going to have a much easier time thinking critically about it or finding the main idea than if I'm reading about a topic I don't know anything about. So, and that's been found over and over again. Have you heard of the baseball study?
Yeah.
So,
but if you can explain
sure.
that, I think it's a very interesting example.
Yeah, so this was a study that was done back in the late 1980s by a couple of researchers who wanted to know what is more important in reading comprehension. Is it general comprehension skill, or is it how much you know about the topic? And they chose the topic of baseball. This was an experiment that was being done with 12 and 13-year-olds. And in the United States, they said, well, there are a lot of kids out there who are not generally good readers, but they know a lot about baseball. And this has been done in Europe with soccer, or what you call football. So they took a bunch of kids, they divided them into 4 groups, depending on how well they had done on a standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And then they gave them a passage to read about it, describing a baseball game, and they tested their comprehension of that passage. And what they found was what really made the difference was knowledge of baseball. The kids who were considered to be generally poor readers, but who knew a lot about baseball, they did much better than the kids who were supposed to be generally good readers, but they didn't know anything about baseball. This has been done, as I said, in other contexts, and it's pretty convincing evidence that knowledge of the topic is important. But some people say, well, you can't, that's silly, you can't teach kids about every single topic they're going to read about, and that's absolutely true. So knowledge of the topic isn't the only thing. Also, as I mentioned, general academic knowledge and vocabulary. And there's also evidence that if the more general academic knowledge and vocabulary you have, the better a general reader you are, a general comprehender. But the way to get that general academic knowledge and vocabulary is through knowing about a lot of topics. It enables you then to read about a topic you don't know much about and learn from that text.
Is that one of the reasons you say in your book that kids should be given books that are a little bit above their level, that are richer and that are not exactly what they would choose by themselves?
Yes, but with an important qualification. So sometimes in the United States, teachers they're told you need rigor, and you have to give kids complex text, and they just hand kids really complex text and say, okay, read this, and it's rigorous, so it's good for you. And the kids can't read the text and they can't understand what they're supposed to be reading. The most efficient way to build academic knowledge and vocabulary when kids are not yet fluent readers is through listening and discussion. So having a teacher or an expert reader read a complex text aloud and engage in discussion of the content of that text. That's because when we're reading, and we're not good readers yet, we have more of a burden on what's called working memory, which is what cognitive scientists call the aspect of our consciousness where we're taking in new information and trying to make sense of it. And the important thing to know about working memory is it's very limited. It can only juggle maybe 4 or 5 things for 20 seconds or so. And so if you're trying to juggle decoding, you're not a great decoder yet, or even if you can decode, but you're just not sure where the emphasis should be in this sentence, that's placing an additional burden on working memory. You don't have as much capacity to think about the meaning. But if somebody else is reading aloud to you, that gives you more capacity to focus on the meaning and to absorb the concepts and the vocabulary. And then when you have that vocabulary and you have those concepts in long-term memory, you have more capacity when you're reading about that topic because the concept is familiar. So the best thing to do to get kids to understand more complex, more rigorous text is first to spend a couple of weeks reading a series of texts aloud, having kids talk about, use the vocabulary in those texts. And then, once they have that information in long-term memory, give them some complex text on that topic. And as in the baseball study, they're probably going to be able to read at a higher level then.
If they have vocabulary, the syntactic rules, if they understand how all the sentences are built and so on.
Well, that's important too.
That's very important. So if I'm understanding you well, you are talking about the first stage when students are not yet able to decode fluently. And fluency is very important.
Yeah.
So even at that stage, we should read to them more complex texts because they would enrich their vocabulary and they enrich their knowledge of the language in general, so how the sentences are built and so on. So that's somehow departing, if I'm understanding it well, from some currents of thought that say kids should read or should be read whatever they like, what's more related to their experiences and so on, what's more basic. And that's not true from what you are saying.
Well, I think, kids should have an opportunity at some point during the school day to choose what they want to read and to read things that are just easy and fun for them to read. But it shouldn't be the centerpiece of the curriculum. And that's what we have now. And it's, there's a sort of romantic ideology in the American education system that just let kids explore.
And not only in America.
Yeah, not only in America. But if we just let kids explore and follow their interests, that they will naturally learn everything they need to know. One problem with that is if you don't know about a topic, it's hard for you to choose it and become interested in it. And what has been found, I think, with teachers who have tried the kind of curriculum that I advocate, which builds knowledge systematically through reading aloud and discussion, kids get very interested in topics in the curriculum that they didn't know about before. They wouldn't have chosen those topics, but once they're introduced to those topics, they want to know more. And the teachers sometimes have to go to the public library to get more books on the topic.
That's very visible at that age, at young age. That's very visible because kids want to know this and to know that. And you talk about the Egyptians and they, what's that? What's that? You talk about the war and what's that?
Yes,
and so on.
And in the United States, unfortunately, there's this very widespread idea that young children will not be interested in things that are remote from their own experience. And so they really should be learning all about me, all about my family, my neighborhood. And those things actually are not that interesting.
Yes.
I mean, any parent
that
knows.
part they know.
Any parent knows that a child can get very interested in, dinosaurs or medieval knights or things that they have had no experience of. And it's really, we've wasted so much precious time by not introducing kids to those things in school because we think they won't be interested.
Absolutely. Well, one thing that we hear a lot from parents is this. My child can read fluently, but he or she can't understand what he or she is reading. So I always thought that this is kind of strange because if they can read fluently, they cannot understand because they don't have the vocabulary or they don't have the knowledge. And for that, you have to teach them the knowledge, you have to teach them the vocabulary and not general skills. What would you say? So what would you recommend? So a parent arrives and tells you, well, my child can read this book completely, but doesn't understand a thing. So there is something wrong with her reading?
Well, that's a problem with the way we define the word reading, because we're including two very different things under that one term. I will say that is not a problem that American parents talk about. They generally, if they complain, it's that their kid is not able to decode. It's called dyslexia, and what you're talking about is called hyperlexia. They can decode, but they can't understand. And so we have to realize that comprehension is very dependent on background knowledge. And so if your child is reading something that they don't understand, it's because they don't have knowledge of the topic or of that vocabulary. And so the thing to do is forget about reading for the moment, teach this child, help this child learn about that topic through which, and then through that process they'll acquire more general academic vocabulary. But just reading, continuing to read things you don't understand, for some kids, maybe they'll be able to teach themselves that way, but many kids need actual teaching, someone explaining things. I don't know if you have this problem in Portugal, but part of the education world's assumption in the United States is that the worst thing a teacher can do is stand up in front of a class and directly explain something. Yeah. I mean, of course, you can overdo that. You can just lecture to a group of 5-year-olds. It's probably not going to work very well. But to explain things and then ask the right questions to get kids to think about those things, that's very important.
So just to summarize it, what's your advice for parents regarding kids reading? So there are 2 stages. First stage, the kids can't read really, or they are just struggling to decode words or syllabus. And the second stage is they can read. So on the first stage, should parents read aloud for their kids? What type of texts?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, while kids are still learning to decode, it's very important to read aloud to them from books that they can't yet read themselves, because that's what's going to build the knowledge and vocabulary. And we can't really wait until later to do that. I mean, in the United States, we're sometimes waiting until high school, and then it's very difficult to make up for all of that lost time.
And on the second stage, so when they are able to read, what's the advice? So should parents suggest texts to kids? What type of texts should they suggest?
I think for parents it is probably important to build on the child's interests. I think especially if they're learning substantive things in school that they're interested in and they want to know more, that parents can feed those interests by finding books that expand on the topics that the kids are interested in. Or they may be interested in just, my son got interested in all sorts of things that had nothing to do with what he was learning in school. And so, we'd go to the library or the bookstore and find more things for him to read that he was interested in. Because motivation is really important. And I think when kids are home, they should be free to pursue what interests them.
But we should provide them with books that that would enlarge their horizons,
yes.
Right?
And I would also say, even after kids have learned to decode, it's important to keep reading aloud to them if they want that, because it has been found that children's, at least in the United States, children's listening comprehension exceeds their reading comprehension on average through about age 13. So it's not just when kids are really young. It lasts for a while, especially if the text is complex.
So going back to the title of your book, there is a gap between what students know and what students should know. But there is also another gap, because this doesn't happen in all classes. So some more affluent neighborhoods and kids that are lucky to have a better education don't have this gap, and others have really a gap. So it's 2 gaps. It's the gap between what they should know, and it's the gap between different types of social environments.
Right, and it's not just, it really starts in the home. So it's really children of more highly educated parents get more exposure to academic vocabulary or sophisticated vocabulary really from birth, and that continues. It's not always because they're getting it from school, because we have the same approach in all schools. So the kids who start out with more of that academic knowledge and vocabulary because they've gotten it from home, first of all, in our system, we let kids read at their what are called their individual reading levels. We require them to read at their individual reading levels. So if you come in and you're already you have more knowledge and vocabulary, you get to read more complex texts, And then because you have related knowledge, you can absorb more information from those texts, and that enables you to read yet more complex texts. So the kids who start out at an advantage become more and more advantaged as the years go by. The other kids who, with less educated parents, they're reading simpler texts because that's all they can read, with less information. And they're less able to retain even that information because they don't have a related background knowledge. You know, it's been said, knowledge is like Velcro, it sticks best to other related knowledge. So those kids with less of that Velcro, they fall farther and farther behind every year if the curriculum doesn't build their knowledge. And so this gap between the good readers and the poor readers gets wider and wider every year. And it's by the time they get to high school, it can be very wide and very difficult to narrow.
But the school can help to narrow that gap. And
Yes.
that's what we should do. That's what we all should do.
Yes, I don't know that the schools can completely close the gap, but they can do much, much more than they're doing
much
now.
better work than they are doing now in the US and I presume in other countries. Well, you look at numbers of PISA and we are not doing well worldwide.
Yes.
So we know that. So there is a long way to go. Natalie, thank you so much. This was a great interview and I think that our readers and our viewers are going to appreciate it a lot.
Thank you.